I paid for my daughter's wedding, and she used it to mock my life in front of 200 guests. I just smiled. Then the groom's boss almost choked when he heard my name and asked for the microphone. What he said made her cry. Michael Anderson had always been a man of few words and many calluses. His hands, worn and scarred from decades under the hoods of broken-down trucks, told the story of a life spent in honest labor. He wasn't a man who had traveled far from home, nor one who had dreams of luxury or fame. But he had one dream that carried him through the long, cold nights in his garage in a small town in rural Ohio. He dreamed of seeing his only daughter, Emily, walk down the aisle. He remembered the day she was born with the same clarity as the oil stains on his workshop floor. Her tiny fingers wrapped around his calloused thumb, her first cry echoing through the sterile hospital room. From that moment on, Michael made a silent vow: she would never feel the weight of struggle he had borne alone. Year after year, while friends took vacations and upgraded cars, Michael tucked away small bills into a tin box behind a loose panel in the kitchen wall. He skipped new boots, avoided dentist visits, and drove his rusted pickup long past the point of safety. Every sacrifice had a purpose. One day, he'd give Emily a wedding she'd never forget. Now, standing in front of the mirror in a rented suit, he could hardly recognize himself. His hair had grayed, his back curved slightly from years of leaning under engines, and his fingers trembled, not from age, but from emotion. The day had arrived. Outside, the wedding venue was already bustling. The white gazebo stood tall under the late afternoon sun, framed by rows of golden chairs and garlands of baby's breath and ivory roses. Michael had worked with the wedding planner himself, poring over every detail to make sure it was perfect. No extravagance, but nothing cheap either. Elegance in simplicity. Emily had always loved that about him. He stepped outside, watching as the guests trickled in, distant relatives, friends from college, co-workers from the groom's side. Most didn't know Michael personally, but they nodded politely. Some smiled. He returned the gestures, unsure if they saw him as the host or just the help. Then, there was Emily. She emerged from the bridal suite in a satin gown that shimmered like moonlight. Her hair, pinned in soft curls, framed a face that now seemed older, more distant. He saw in her the girl he had raised, but also a woman shaped by a world he never fully understood. She was smiling, but her eyes were fixed ahead. She hadn't looked for him yet. Michael swallowed the ache in his throat and turned to help direct guests to their seats. He didn't need attention. He only wanted to witness her happiness. The photographer directed people into position, and Michael was summoned to stand beside Emily for a pre-ceremony shot. She greeted him with a quick hug, light and impersonal, then turned to pose. "You look beautiful," he whispered. She smiled, but didn't respond. He tried not to read into it. Perhaps it was nerves, or the pressure of the day. He convinced himself it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was here, radiant, about to begin a new chapter. And he had done his part. As the time neared for the ceremony to begin, the hum of conversation grew louder. Michael took his seat near the front, next to the aisle. He folded his hands in his lap and looked around the hall. The decorations were just as they had envisioned: white tablecloths, golden centerpieces, a soft blend of classical and acoustic music drifting from the speakers. He caught sight of the groom, David, adjusting his tie near the altar. He was tall, sharply dressed, and from a family that lived a very different life from Michael's. Still, the young man had always been respectful when they spoke. That counted for something. Michael took a deep breath. The music shifted. The ceremony was about to begin. This was the moment he had dreamed of. A day that had seemed impossibly distant for so long was now unfolding before him in vivid color. The years of sacrifice, the missed meals, the cold winters in an unheated garage, it had all led to this. He smiled, feeling his chest swell with pride. But what Michael didn't know was that this day, the one he had imagined as the most joyful of his life, was about to take a turn that would shake him to his core. A single moment, hidden among the laughter and celebration, was waiting to cut deeper than any wrench or broken gear ever had. Because sometimes, pride can become the sharpest edge. And sometimes, the people we love the most are the ones who hurt us without even realizing it. Michael Anderson was about to find that out the hard way. The music changed once more, shifting into a tender piano arrangement that signaled the ceremony's official beginning. Guests rose from their seats with a rustle of fabric and hushed whispers, craning their necks toward the double doors at the end of the aisle. The room, moments ago filled with idle chatter and the occasional clink of glassware, fell into reverent silence. Michael Anderson stood near the front, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the polished aisle. His heart pounded with anticipation, not nerves, at least, not for himself, but with the same inexplicable mix of pride and melancholy that had crept into him since morning. He had imagined this moment in abstract for years, but the reality had more weight than he expected. More texture. More ache. The doors opened. Emily appeared, framed by light and held gently by the arm of her mother, Linda. Her gown flowed like liquid satin, every step deliberate, graceful. Her smile was gentle, photogenic, curated. But Michael, watching from just feet away, sensed a disconnect. Not quite coldness, but distance. An unfamiliar coolness in her eyes, as if she were playing a part rather than living a moment. He'd seen her beam more freely at childhood birthdays or when showing off a freshly drawn picture from school. This smile was something else. Applause did not erupt, only the admiring murmurs and quiet gasps of guests appreciating the bride's beauty. A photographer backed down the aisle slowly, snapping images from just the right angles. Cell phones glowed as some discreetly recorded the moment. Michael stood still, absorbing it all, the rows of white chairs, the perfumed air, the gold-trimmed altar, the guests leaning toward the aisle with the same expression, admiration touched with envy. Emily's gaze floated over the guests, occasionally landing on a familiar face. She nodded to some, briefly smiled at others. She reached the end of the aisle and released her mother's arm before stepping to stand beside David, who greeted her with a soft whisper. Michael couldn't hear it, but he saw the small exchange, a light touch on the hand, a glance of assurance. They looked good together. On the surface. The officiant, a well-groomed man in his 40s with a confident voice, welcomed everyone and began the ceremony. He spoke of union, of journey, of love enduring across time and difficulty. Michael listened, though not intently. His mind wandered toward the subtle details. The stiffness in Emily's shoulders. The way David glanced toward the crowd every few minutes, as if scanning for approval. Even the seating arrangements felt distant. He'd been placed near the front, yes, but not beside his daughter. That seat had been given to Linda's new husband, Greg, who chatted amiably with a woman Michael didn't recognize. Michael shifted in his chair. As vows began, he caught a few sideways glances from nearby guests. Some were kind, others curious. A woman near the back whispered something to her companion, her hand lifting in a half gesture toward Michael's seat. He turned away, trying not to wonder what they were saying. He knew how he looked, suit slightly out of date, boots just a bit too worn, a posture shaped by decades of labor rather than leisure. He didn't fit neatly among the well-pressed suits and high-end perfumes. But he was there. He belonged. Or so he tried to believe. Emily's voice rose now, clear and poised, reciting lines she had clearly practiced. Words about loyalty, partnership, shared futures. David responded in kind. They exchanged rings. A smattering of applause followed. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. There was no cheering, just polite claps, a few tears, and a chorus of sighs. But Michael didn't stand. He remained seated, his hands resting on his thighs, his face still. It wasn't that he wasn't proud. He was. He just didn't feel part of the moment. It was happening before him, not with him. As the couple walked down the aisle together, arm in arm, the photographer darted around them to capture reactions. Michael forced a smile when the lens turned briefly toward him, but it vanished the second it passed. He clapped, quietly, and remained in his chair as others stood, cheered, and began following the couple out of the hall toward the reception area. He took his time rising. When most had filtered out, He moved toward the back of the room and out into the wide corridor that led to the reception hall, a grand room with golden chandeliers and tables dressed in white and silver. Servers in black attire circled with trays of champagne and tiny hors d'oeuvres Michael couldn't name. He accepted a glass out of politeness, holding it awkwardly. The bubbles tickled his nose. He hadn't eaten all day but didn't feel hungry. As more guests arrived, laughter grew louder. Music drifted in, a live string quartet at the far end of the hall. Michael drifted along the edge of the room, looking for somewhere to sit. His assigned table, number 5, was already occupied by 2 of Emily's college friends and a couple he'd never met. They looked up as he approached and offered vague smiles, scooting their chairs slightly. No one introduced themselves. He sat. They talked among themselves, ignoring him. Their conversation moved quickly, mentions of art shows in New York, a vineyard trip in Sonoma, some startup success story. Michael couldn't follow. He stared at his glass, then the centerpiece, white hydrangeas in a golden vase, tiny crystals hanging from the branches. From across the room, he noticed Emily laughing with a group near the cake table. David stood beside her, sipping champagne, one hand on her back. She looked relaxed now, surrounded by her world, the one she had built away from him. Still, Michael waited for the part he had imagined the most. The father-daughter dance. The moment she would come find him, lead him to the floor, and they would share a small piece of the spotlight. That was still to come. That would be his. But it didn't happen yet. Instead, the MC announced the start of the speeches. A toast from the maid of honor first, Emily's best friend since freshman year, who gave a sweet, rehearsed tribute full of inside jokes and college memories. Then came David's brother, who made the crowd laugh with stories of childhood antics and sentimental nods to love and growth. And then it happened. The MC called Emily up for a surprise speech on behalf of the bride. Michael's ears perked up. She took the microphone with a confident smile and turned to the crowd. "I just want to say how grateful I am for everyone being here," she began. "It's been such a beautiful day, and honestly, it's all a bit surreal." The guests chuckled politely. "I was thinking earlier about all the people who helped me get here. Obviously David, who's been my rock. My amazing mom. And, well, of course, my dad." Michael straightened in his chair, heart rising. Emily turned slightly toward him. "Now, my dad, Michael Anderson, is a very unique guy," she said, drawing out the last words with a playful tone. "Growing up, I used to say he smelled like engine grease more than aftershave. His idea of gourmet cooking was grilled cheese with a side of ketchup." The room laughed. So did Emily. Michael did not. "And let's just say, if I had $1 for every time I got dropped off at school in a pickup that looked like it belonged in a junkyard, I'd probably have paid for this wedding myself." More laughter. Louder this time. Emily giggled. "Seriously though, my dad's always been there, even if it was in boots covered in oil and a shirt with his name stitched on the pocket." Michael. Like people didn't know who he was. Another wave of laughter. This one hit harder. Michael smiled, barely. But something inside him recoiled. He felt a pressure in his chest, slow and growing. These were stories he might have laughed at in private, in a moment of closeness. But here, amplified through speakers and served up for entertainment, they cut differently. Emily went on, light-hearted, unaware, or maybe unbothered, by the impact of her words. The speech ended with a toast, glasses raised, and more applause. Michael lifted his glass, touched it to his lips, but didn't drink. Around him, the conversations resumed. The music swelled. Laughter returned. And Michael sat, motionless, in a room full of people celebrating. But he had never felt more alone. As the final notes of polite applause faded into the background and Emily returned the microphone to the MC, Michael remained seated, his glass still untouched. Around him, conversation resumed like a faucet turned back on, fluid, effortless, oblivious. But for Michael, something in the air had changed. the laughter he had just heard, echoing around the decorated hall, still rang in his ears, but now with a different tone. Not joyful. Not celebratory. Mocking. He looked across the table, but the young couple who had laughed the loudest during Emily's speech were now scrolling through their phones. Another guest was busy adjusting her dress strap. No one noticed the tightening of his jaw, the slow blink as he tried to hold back something he hadn't expected to feel today: humiliation. He had always known he wasn't like the other guests. He had accepted long ago that his life, his clothes, his vocabulary, his manners even, would never match the polished elegance that seemed effortless for people like David's family. But he had truly believed, that none of that would matter today. That he would be seen for what he had given, not for what he lacked. As waiters began setting down the first course, a crisp salad with ingredients Michael couldn't name, he excused himself from the table. No one tried to stop him. He moved slowly through the reception hall, weaving between the tables and ignoring the glance of a man who tried to usher him back with a polite gesture. He pretended not to notice. He needed air. Outside, the late afternoon had begun to slip into early evening. The air had cooled, and the sun hung low, casting golden shadows across the gravel path that led to a small garden at the rear of the venue. Michael walked there, away from the music and the soft clinking of silverware. He sat on a stone bench near a shallow fountain. The rhythmic sound of water offered some comfort, as did the solitude. From here, the laughter inside was muted. He could still hear it, but it was no longer overwhelming. He stared at the fountain for several minutes, then pulled a crumpled paper napkin from his coat pocket and wiped his hands, though they weren't dirty. It was just something to do. Footsteps approached. He braced for a familiar voice, maybe Emily's, maybe David's. But it wasn't either. "Mr. Anderson?" The voice was low, male, unfamiliar. Michael turned slightly. A man in his early 50s stood beside the path. Tall, clean-shaven, with sharp features and an expensive-looking suit. The kind of man who walked into a room and made people straighten their posture without knowing why. "Yes?" Michael replied cautiously. "I hope I'm not interrupting," the man said, stepping forward. "My name's Richard Collins. I'm David's boss." Michael stood, extending a hand out of instinct. "Nice to meet you." They shook hands. Richard's grip was firm, but not overbearing. "I just wanted to say," Richard continued, "that I caught your daughter's speech earlier." Michael managed a smile. "Yeah. Quite the storyteller." Richard looked at him, his expression unreadable at first. Then, to Michael's surprise, the man chuckled, just once. "I'll be honest, it didn't sit right with me." Michael blinked. "Sorry?" "The way she spoke about you. I understand humor. I understand trying to keep things light. But, something about it bothered me. Maybe it's because I come from a similar place." Michael raised an eyebrow. "I grew up working in my father's auto shop," Richard explained. "Learned more under the hood of a car than I ever did in a classroom. Haven't touched a wrench in years, but I remember what it felt like to be covered in grease before 9 o'clock in the morning." Michael's posture relaxed slightly. "I didn't know that," he said. "Not many do," Richard replied. "I'm not ashamed of it. But I've learned that in certain rooms, people measure you by different rulers." Michael nodded, slowly. Richard looked toward the reception hall. "They're preparing for the toasts. I assume you'll be speaking?" Michael shook his head. "Wasn't asked." Richard frowned. "Seriously?" Michael shrugged. "Doesn't matter." But it did matter. And Richard saw it. "Well," Richard said after a pause, "if you change your mind, I'd be happy to make sure you get the mic." Michael offered another polite smile. "Appreciate it. But I think I'll sit this one out." Richard studied him for another moment, then gave a respectful nod and turned back toward the hall. Michael remained on the bench long after Richard had gone. He didn't feel angry, at least, not in the way he understood anger. It was something quieter, more exhausting. A kind of sadness that came when the things you loved most failed to recognize the shape of your love. Eventually, he returned to the reception, slipping in just as the second course was cleared. He sat silently at his table, unnoticed. The MC called for the first official toast. This time, David took the mic. He thanked the guests, praised his new bride, and made an extended, almost theatrical acknowledgement of his parents' support, his brother's help organizing the wedding, and his mentors. He raised his glass and toasted to a future filled with partnership, prosperity, and patience. The crowd echoed his words. Glasses clinked. Smiles all around. Michael lifted his own glass but didn't drink. Again. Then, before the MC could continue, Emily stepped forward again. "One last thing," she said, taking the mic back with a grin. "Before we move to dinner and dancing, I just want to add a few more thank yous." Michael felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe she had felt it too, had realized the sting her words left earlier and wanted to make amends. Maybe this was the moment he had been waiting for. "I want to thank my amazing in-laws for being so welcoming. My college advisor, who taught me more than she knows. And of course," she glanced briefly in Michael's direction, "my dad. Who always made sure I had what I needed. Even if it meant fixing cars late into the night." Michael waited. For more. For something personal. Something warm. But that was it. She smiled, waved, and handed the mic back. The applause resumed. The music followed. And Michael remained still in his chair, realizing that the speech he had waited years for would not come. Not tonight. Dinner had been served. Plates of seared meat, roasted vegetables, and artfully drizzled sauces made their way across the tables, accompanied by soft background music that blended with the clinking of cutlery and low hum of conversation. Waiters moved like shadows between the tables, precise and silent. Michael stared down at his plate. The food looked fine, but he hadn't touched it. His appetite had withered somewhere between the first toast and the last polite smile Emily had given him. Around him, laughter and cheerfulness filled the room like the sound of distant waves, constant, soothing to some, but indifferent to him. He tried to listen to the conversation at his table, but it was fragmented, and none of it concerned him. Someone was talking about a new investment fund. Another mentioned their recent trip to the Amalfi Coast. A third guest had become enthralled by an app that matched donors with nonprofits in real time. Michael didn't speak. No one asked him to. He existed on the edges of their vision, a quiet presence easily overlooked. As the meal wound down, a change in lighting signaled the transition to the next part of the evening. The dance floor, until then a gleaming expanse of polished wood, was now illuminated by golden overhead lights. The MC returned to the stage, microphone in hand, his voice smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "it is time for a very special moment. The newlyweds will now share their first dance as husband and wife." Applause scattered across the room. Guests leaned toward the floor with their phones ready, some standing to get a better view. The string quartet adjusted in the corner, and soft notes of a familiar ballad began to fill the space. David and Emily stepped into the light. His hand gently found hers. Her other hand rested on his shoulder. They began to sway, their movements synchronized, measured. A photographer circled them like a satellite, capturing every angle. Michael remained seated, hands folded on the table. He watched, but not in awe. Something within him had grown quiet, colder. The spark he had carried into the day, fueled by pride, by dreams, by years of waiting, had dimmed, its flame replaced by a stillness he couldn't quite define. He didn't feel anger, exactly. It was more like a hollow understanding settling inside him, as if the truth had finally made itself clear. He had misread something fundamental. The girl he had raised, the one who once clung to his arm as they crossed snowy sidewalks, who used to run to the garage just to be near him, was not the same woman in the white dress. That version of her lived in a different time. The woman dancing now, laughing in the arms of a man whose world was so unlike Michael's, had chosen her path. And in doing so, she had stepped away from his. When the music ended and applause returned, Michael clapped with everyone else, but his hands barely made a sound. The MC continued, now inviting all married couples to the dance floor. Dozens stood, some elderly and slow-moving, others younger and full of energy. A mix of generations joined together in celebration. Michael stayed seated. He saw Greg, his ex-wife's new husband, laughing as he pulled Linda onto the dance floor. They moved with the comfort of familiarity, drawing compliments from guests nearby. Michael looked away. A server approached and offered him a refill of wine. He declined. Instead, he rose and walked to the far side of the room where the bar stood. It was quieter there. He leaned against the counter, the surface cool beneath his forearms, and asked for a glass of water. The bartender nodded and poured it without a word. He took a sip and stared into the room. The dancing had intensified. Pop music now replaced the string quartet. The lights dimmed, flashing colors now swirling over the dancers. Voices rose. People let loose. And then, amidst it all, he saw her. Emily. Laughing. Twirling. Surrounded by friends, her hands in the air. Her dress shimmered as she spun. She looked free. Untouched by anything that might have lingered in her father's eyes. She wasn't hiding or carrying guilt. If anything, she seemed more alive now than before. Michael watched for a moment longer, then turned away. He left the bar and wandered toward the hallway that led to the restrooms, pausing near the entrance where a framed collage of wedding photos had been placed on an easel. There were pictures of Emily and David in vineyards, on beaches, in restaurants with soft lighting and expensive meals. Michael wasn't in any of them. Not one. His eyes paused on a photo of Emily as a child, perhaps 6 years old, her smile missing 2 front teeth. She was holding a toy wrench, sitting beside him under a truck. He remembered that day. She'd insisted on helping, and he'd let her tighten bolts with an old tool that no longer worked. She had gotten grease on her shirt. Linda had been furious. That photo didn't make the display. He stared a moment longer, then returned to the hallway, unsure of where to go next. The reception had moved on without him, and the evening was still young. There was no assigned role left for him to play. In the corridor, he found a narrow bench and sat. He had barely rested there for more than 2 minutes when he heard voices approaching. Laughter. Familiar. Emily and 2 of her friends turned the corner, heels clicking against the tile. They didn't notice him at first. One of them said something, he couldn't make out the words, but they all laughed. Emily leaned against the wall, adjusting the strap of her shoe. I swear, I thought he was going to cry, one of the girls said, grinning. Your dad. During your speech. Michael didn't breathe. Emily gave a small laugh. I mean, probably. He always was kind of sensitive. The friend replied, still, you went easy on him. I didn't want to ruin the mood, Emily said, brushing her hair back. Besides, it's just who he is. He doesn't care. That kind of stuff goes over his head. The words landed heavier than any he'd heard that night. He stood. The movement caught Emily's eye. Her face changed instantly, surprise, then guilt, then something unreadable. Dad, she began, stepping forward. Michael raised a hand slightly. No need, he said, voice calm, even. You're busy. He offered a nod, not cold, not angry, just distant, and turned back down the hallway without waiting for her reply. He didn't return to the reception. Instead, he stepped outside once more, into the night that had grown darker, cooler. The stars were out now, faint above the glow of the venue lights. A breeze moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of flowers and distant music. Michael sat on a bench near the edge of the parking lot, watching the sky. He had dreamed of this day for so long. Had imagined pride, tears of joy, the moment when his daughter would look into his eyes and understand everything he had given. All the quiet sacrifices. all the nights spent working under flickering bulbs and biting cold. He had thought it would all culminate here, in gratitude and love. But some things, he was beginning to understand, didn't end the way you expected. Sometimes, they didn't end at all. They just changed. And left you to figure out what to do with the silence they left behind. The stars above the Ohio countryside stretched silently across the night sky, muted by the soft halo of lights from the wedding venue behind him. Michael remained on the bench near the parking lot, arms resting on his knees, eyes lost in the horizon where the sky met dark silhouettes of trees. Somewhere in the distance, frogs sang their slow chorus from a pond or stream. He welcomed the sound. It was one of the few things that made sense. Inside, the music had shifted again. The thud of bass from newer pop songs pulsed faintly through the walls. Laughter rose and fell in waves. The wedding was in full swing, but Michael had quietly stepped out of it, both physically and emotionally. He wasn't sure if he would return. Part of him wondered if anyone would notice if he didn't. Footsteps crunched against the gravel nearby. He didn't look up at first. He assumed it was another guest on a phone call or sneaking a cigarette. But the sound stopped a few feet from him, and a voice cut gently through the dark. "Mind if I join you?" Michael turned his head. It was Richard Collins, David's boss. The same man who had approached him earlier by the fountain. His blazer was now slung casually over one shoulder, tie slightly loosened, posture relaxed but observant. Michael didn't speak right away. Richard gestured toward the bench. "I can go back inside if you want space." Michael finally nodded, and the man sat. For a few moments, neither spoke. They simply sat side by side, two figures lit by the glow of distant string lights and a sliver of moon. "You've been out here a while," Richard said softly. Michael didn't answer. He tilted his head slightly but kept his gaze forward. "Funny," Richard continued, "these events, they're built up to feel like milestones. Like something you'll carry forever, in a good way. But for some of us, they land differently." Michael glanced sideways. "You sound like you've been in this seat before." Richard chuckled, but not mockingly. "I have," he said. "Different story, same feeling." Michael looked at him more directly now, a question behind his silence. "My daughter," Richard said, answering the unspoken thought. "She got married 6 years ago. Big wedding. Country club, 4-tier cake, a jazz trio from New Orleans. The whole production." He paused. "I wasn't invited." Michael's eyes narrowed. "What?" "Her mother and I divorced when she was 10. It wasn't ugly, but I drifted. My career took off, and somewhere along the way, my daughter and I just stopped speaking. I thought I could make it up later. I thought she'd understand eventually." Michael waited. She didn't. Still doesn't. They sat in silence again. The breeze tugged gently at the leaves above them. "Why are you telling me this?" Michael asked at last. Richard breathed deeply. "Because I saw something tonight. In there. During those speeches. The way people reacted. The way you didn't." Michael's jaw tensed. "I'm not trying to pity you," Richard added quickly. "You don't strike me as someone who'd accept it anyway. I'm saying I recognize something familiar. That quiet you carry around." Michael took that in, slowly. He wasn't used to being seen, especially not by men like Richard, men who wore power like a second skin. But Richard's tone wasn't condescending. It was level. Real. "I worked my whole life for her," Michael finally said. "Skipped vacations. Drove beat-up trucks until they died on the road. Saved every spare dime just to give her a day like this." "I believe you," Richard said. Michael's voice thickened, but he didn't let it crack. "And now it feels like it wasn't for her at all. It was for some version of her I've been holding on to. A version that doesn't exist anymore." Richard nodded slowly. "Or maybe she still exists, but she's buried under a life she's trying to fit into. Michael looked away again. Doesn't change what she said. No, Richard agreed. But it might change what she meant. The two men sat a moment longer. Then, from across the gravel path, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the quiet. A flash of a white dress caught in motion. Emily. She stopped just shy of the bench, breath uneven, heels sinking slightly into the soft dirt. Her eyes flicked to Richard, then back to her father. "Dad," she said, barely above a whisper. Michael looked up. I didn't know you were out here. I was looking for you." He said nothing. She stepped forward. "I didn't mean for any of that to come across like I was making fun of you. I was just trying to be funny, keep things light. That's all." Michael looked at her, his face unreadable. "I was nervous. Everyone was watching. I don't know. I thought I could make people laugh." "You did," he said, his voice calm, but distant. Emily's face fell. "I didn't think you'd take it that way." Michael turned toward her. "Then you didn't think at all?" She blinked, stunned by the directness. "I worked for 30 years to make sure you never felt the weight I did. And maybe I made that too easy for you. Maybe that's why you don't see the value in what built this day." Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. "I'm not angry," Michael continued. "Not in the way you think. I'm just tired." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Emily took a small step closer. "You raised me to be strong. To speak my mind." "I did," he agreed. "But I never taught you how to see the strength in silence. In quiet effort. In dignity." She looked down. "I'm sorry, Dad." It was the first time he'd heard that in years. Maybe ever. He looked past her, toward the venue, then at Richard. The older man stood. "I'll give you two a moment." Michael watched as he walked away, disappearing into the light. Emily sat where he'd been. "I saw the picture," Michael said. "In the hallway. The one under the truck. You left it out." "I didn't mean to. There were too many to choose from." "Right." Emily looked at her hands. "I wanted to include it. I just thought, maybe it didn't fit with the rest." Michael nodded, almost imperceptibly. "It's okay," he said. "I don't need to be in your gallery. I just didn't think I'd end up outside of your story altogether." Emily's eyes welled. "You're not." He didn't respond. She reached out, but hesitated. "Can you come back inside? Please?" Michael stood, not answering. He looked up at the stars once more, then turned toward the path. "I'll think about it." He began walking. Emily didn't follow. She remained on the bench, her hands clasped tightly, her heart louder than the music inside. Richard Collins stepped back into the venue, letting the warmth and light swallow him. The music had returned to a lower volume, slower now, something romantic to usher in a second wave of couples to the dance floor. Servers glided between tables offering coffee, and guests now seemed more relaxed, ties loosened, shoes kicked off under tables, champagne flutes half full. He glanced toward the stage where the MC was reviewing a short list on his clipboard. The man looked efficient, but not immune to a subtle suggestion. Richard crossed the room with intention and waited until the MC noticed him. "May I help you, sir?" the man asked, adjusting his headset mic slightly. Richard offered a diplomatic smile. "I was wondering if I might speak for a moment." The MC glanced at his notes again. "We've got the cake cutting, a final toast from the best man, and a closing dance queued up." "I understand," Richard said. "But I believe what I have to say will be well received, and meaningful." The MC hesitated, his professionalism momentarily unsure of how to navigate an unplanned deviation. "I won't take long," Richard added. "But I think this room would benefit from hearing it." There was something in the way he spoke, not forceful, not pleading, just resolute, that made it impossible to reject him outright. After a beat of silence, The MC nodded. I'll give you a slot after the cake cutting. 2 minutes. Richard extended a hand. That's all I'll need. As the MC walked off to adjust the lineup, Richard turned and surveyed the room. His eyes landed on Emily, who had returned inside but was now standing alone near the dessert table, nervously sipping from a flute of sparkling water. Her friends were on the dance floor, and David was deep in conversation with an uncle near the bar. She was searching for something, though she likely didn't know what. Maybe a signal that her apology had reached her father. Maybe a reason to believe the distance could still shrink before the night ended. Richard made his way toward her, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had seen what mattered and refused to let it vanish. Emily noticed him just before he reached her. "Hi," she said, her voice smaller now. "You've been talking with my dad, haven't you?" "I have," Richard replied. She shifted uncomfortably. "Is he okay?" "He's not hurt," Richard said. "But he's been carrying something heavy for a long time." Tonight added weight where he'd hoped there would be relief. Emily looked away. Richard waited, then continued, "You said earlier that your speech was meant to be light. That you were nervous." "I was," she said. "Still am." "That's fair," Richard said. "But nervousness doesn't excuse blindness." She nodded slowly. "I want to say something tonight," Richard added. "Publicly?" Emily blinked. "Why?" "Because I think your father deserves to be seen. Not just by you, but by this entire room." Her lips parted slightly, uncertain whether to object or let it happen. In the end, she said nothing. Richard walked back to his table and waited for the right moment. Minutes later, the cake was cut with exaggerated cheers and exaggerated grins. Cameras flashed. Guests clapped. The best man's toast followed, short, funny, slightly drunken, and the MC returned to the mic with a tone that suggested the night was winding down. But then, he cleared his throat. "Before we move on to our final dance," he announced, "we have a brief word from someone very special. Mr. Richard Collins, who many of you may know, has asked to say a few words. Please give him your attention." Murmurs passed through the room as Richard walked calmly to the front. David looked surprised. Emily looked frozen. Michael was nowhere in sight. Richard accepted the mic, adjusted it slightly in his hand, and spoke. "I promise to be brief," he began. "But I've been to a lot of weddings. I've seen a lot of ceremonies, a lot of speeches. I've toasted more than my fair share of couples, danced at more receptions than I can count. And I've learned something important over time." He paused, letting the room settle. Weddings are never just about the couple. They're about the people who built them. The ones who made sacrifices so quiet, so constant, that no one noticed them until they were gone. A few heads turned, sensing something deeper beneath his words. "I met a man tonight. You might not know him. He didn't speak during the ceremony. He didn't raise a glass during the toast. But his fingerprints are all over this room." The silence deepened. "Years ago, when I was just starting out, I broke down on a back road in the middle of winter. I was fresh out of college, broke, and cold. My phone was dead. No one would stop." His eyes moved slowly across the room. But one man did. He pulled up in a truck that looked like it had been through 5 wars. Climbed out with hands that were black with grease. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for thanks. He said, "Pop the hood." And he worked for 40 minutes in the snow until I could drive again. Gasps rose quietly from a few guests who suddenly realized where this was going. That man didn't just fix my car. He changed how I saw people. How I valued service. How I defined integrity. He looked directly at Emily. And tonight, I saw that same man made the butt of a joke. Emily's eyes brimmed with tears. "That man," Richard continued, "is Michael Anderson. He is the reason your daughter had this wedding. He is the reason your son-in-law had the chance to meet her. Because if not for him, I might not be standing here at all." A stunned silence settled over the crowd. Richard lowered his voice. Greatness doesn't always come in tailored suits or Ivy League resumes. Sometimes, it comes in grease-stained boots and calloused hands. Sometimes, it sits in silence while the world forgets its name. He stepped back. To Michael Anderson, thank you. For what you gave. For who you are. He set the mic down. No music played. No one moved. And then, one by one, people began to rise. First a few. Then more. Applause broke out, not forced, not polite, but full, rising, a roar of recognition and shame and admiration all at once. At the back of the room, unnoticed until now, Michael stood. He had returned. Quietly. He met Richard's eyes across the crowd, and for the first time that night, he smiled, not out of politeness, but with the quiet peace of a man who had been seen. The applause didn't end quickly. It started as an echo of Richard's tribute but grew into something else entirely, an unspoken apology from the crowd, from every guest who had chuckled during Emily's speech or failed to notice the quiet man seated alone at table 5. It was more than politeness. It was reverence, sparked by a realization they hadn't expected to find beneath the glamour of the evening. Michael stood at the back of the room, partially lit by the spill of golden light from the chandeliers. His suit looked wrinkled, his boots still bore the dull edge of wear, but in that moment, none of it mattered. People turned toward him, not in amusement, but with recognition. A few even stepped aside, allowing a clear path through the crowd. He remained still for a moment, as though unsure whether to return to the shadows or step into the light. Then, as if moved by something deeper than will, he began to walk. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. But each step he took forward felt like it carried the weight of years, the unpaid bills, the skipped vacations, the long hours under rusted chassis, the late nights and early mornings that had shaped his life around someone else's dream. He passed by guests who nodded solemnly, some touching his arm or shoulder as he passed. He didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on the stage where Richard now waited, his expression respectful, his hands clasped in front of him. Emily stood off to the side. Her face was still flushed, her mascara slightly smudged from unshed tears. She didn't move toward her father, but her eyes followed him with something raw, no longer shame, but awakening. When Michael reached the edge of the stage, the MC instinctively stepped forward, offering the microphone as though drawn by a force beyond his role. Michael paused. He hadn't planned to speak. That much was obvious. He hadn't written anything. He wasn't dressed for speeches or trained in the rhythms of public address. But the room was silent. Waiting. He took the microphone. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Just looked out over the room full of eyes. I didn't expect this, he began, his voice low and gravelly from age and disuse. Didn't come here for attention. He glanced at Richard. But thank you. Then he looked at Emily, holding her gaze, not angrily, not sternly, but with the quiet steadiness of a man who had nothing left to prove. I've spent most of my life under cars, he continued. Some of them belonged to farmers, some to factory workers. A few didn't even run when they got to me, and most of them didn't look worth saving. A murmur of soft chuckles rose, more empathetic than amused. But I fixed what I could. Not because the cars were special. Because someone needed them to run. He paused again, letting the meaning settle. Sometimes, I think people are like that too. Bent. Broken. Stuck. Covered in years of wear and bad choices. Doesn't mean they're not worth saving. The silence deepened. I never went to college. I didn't wear a suit to work. I didn't raise my voice in boardrooms. But I was proud of the grease on my hands. Still am. Because it meant I was doing something that mattered. He looked at Emily again. You don't owe me praise. Or apologies. What I gave freely. She began to cry, quietly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. But I hope one day, when you look back at this night, not at the cake or the flowers or the speeches. I hope you'll remember the man who waited in silence. And loved you anyway." He held the mic at his side. The room didn't erupt this time. It stood still. Listening. Breathing. Then Richard stepped forward, placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, and leaned toward the mic. "There's something else you should know," Richard said. "I didn't just stop tonight to tell you about a good deed. I stopped because that act, years ago, changed more than just my night. It changed my life." Michael looked puzzled. "I never told you what kind of shape I was in that night when you found me on that road. I was more than stranded. I was lost. I'd been rejected from a company I'd dreamed of working for. My fiancée had just broken off our engagement. I was broke, angry, and ready to walk away from everything. I even thought about ending my own life that night." A gasp rippled through the guests. Michael's brow furrowed in disbelief. "But then you stopped," Richard continued. "You showed up like a ghost in the snow. No name. No bill. Just help." He turned to face the crowd again. "Michael Anderson didn't just fix my engine that night. He reminded me that good still existed. That strangers could care. That the road could still lead somewhere." The weight of his words hung heavy, like a storm cloud ready to break. "I went home," he said, voice thick now, "and I didn't give up. I reapplied. I worked harder. I built my own company from scratch. And I vowed that if I ever reached the top, I'd remember the man who showed me what it looked like to serve with nothing to gain." He turned to Michael again. "And I never forgot your name." The audience rose to their feet in silence, a quiet storm of emotion moving through them as they applauded. Not loud. Not rowdy. But with reverence. Michael looked stunned. Not by the praise, but by the revelation. He had never imagined that a moment of simple service, forgotten by him, routine at best, had become a turning point in someone else's life. Emily stepped forward. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her arms wrapped around her father's shoulders, and for the first time that night, the distance closed. Michael didn't hug her back immediately. His arms hung at his sides. Then slowly, deliberately, he lifted them and held her. Not tightly. Just enough. Enough to say everything that hadn't been said. The crowd continued to stand, watching not a speech, not a show, but a quiet reunion between a father and a daughter who had finally seen each other through the fog of pride and misunderstanding. And somewhere in the back of the room, unnoticed, a guest wiped their eyes and whispered to no one in particular. That was the real ceremony. The room remained standing. No one told them to, but something sacred had taken root in the silence left after Michael's embrace with Emily. It wasn't a moment crafted for Instagram stories or photo albums. It was too raw for that, too real. People held their glasses, their programs, their breath, waiting for something more, or maybe just trying to process what they had witnessed. The MC, now standing awkwardly at the edge of the room, seemed unsure whether to resume the evening or simply let it fade into quiet. He looked toward Richard for guidance, but Richard gave a subtle shake of the head. This wasn't a moment to transition. It was a moment to surrender to. Emily stepped back from her father, her hands still on his arms. "Dad," she said, voice trembling, "why didn't you ever tell me that story?" Michael looked at her gently. "Because it wasn't about the story," he replied. "It was just something I did. Like 1,000 other nights. But that one night changed everything for him." Michael nodded. "That's the thing about helping people. You don't always know when it matters. You just do it anyway." Emily lowered her gaze, ashamed of how many times she had seen him come home late, covered in grease and exhaustion, and thought it was just another day. How many nights he had quietly made her life easier without saying a word. She had always assumed it was just what fathers did. She had never paused to ask what it had cost him. Richard cleared his throat from beside them. He stepped forward slightly, his voice now softer, less formal. "I've told that story maybe a dozen times in private boardrooms," he said. But never publicly. And never with you standing here. Michael met his eyes, still stunned, still processing. I knew your name, Richard continued. It was stitched on your chest, Michael Anderson. It never left my mind. I looked for you more than once over the years, but Anderson is a common name. I didn't even know what town to start with. Then tonight, I heard your daughter mention you in her speech, and something clicked. When I saw you, I knew. Your face. Your hands. The way you stood. It all came back. Michael didn't speak, but he nodded once. Richard turned to the room again. Some of you know me as a CEO, a mentor, a speaker. Some of you have attended my conferences. But I owe a great deal of that success to a man most of you probably overlooked tonight. A man who, by doing the right thing on a cold night, gave me back my direction. He paused. And now you know his name. His voice became stronger. Michael Anderson. The words echoed through the hall, spoken not with reverence alone, but with truth. Michael Anderson. The name wasn't grand. It didn't belong to a man of wealth or fame. But now, it hung in the air with a kind of quiet power. Guests began to murmur his name under their breath. Michael Anderson. A few guests clapped again, softer this time, more personal. One older gentleman near the back stood and offered a slow, deliberate salute. A woman touched her heart. Another young man whispered the name to his wife, as if committing it to memory. Emily turned to the crowd. I spent my whole life saying that name, she said, voice breaking. Michael Anderson. But I didn't really understand what it meant. Not until tonight. She turned to her father, tears streaming now, unashamed. I'm so sorry, Dad. Michael took her hand. You don't have to be, he said. Not anymore. He looked over her shoulder toward David, who stood nearby, speechless. Michael nodded once, and David, to his credit, stepped forward and extended his hand. I don't have the words, David said. You don't need them, Michael replied. Just treat her right. David's grip tightened. I will. I promise. A hush settled again. The music hadn't resumed. The dancing had stopped. But no one complained. The guests weren't waiting for entertainment. They were bearing witness to something far rarer than spectacle, redemption, humility, the quiet mending of a family once divided by misunderstanding. Richard stepped to the mic once more. I think we've all had enough speeches tonight, he said, smiling. But before the night ends, I want to make one thing clear, not just to Emily and David, but to all of you here. He gestured toward Michael. This man is a reminder. That you never know who you're sitting next to. That humility isn't weakness. That a life spent in quiet service can carry more power than a title ever could. He nodded to the DJ, signaling the return of music. But now, he said, stepping back, I think we've all earned a moment to celebrate. The first few notes of a slow song began, rich and melodic, casting a gentle rhythm over the room. Michael looked at the dance floor, then at Emily. She hesitated. Would you still dance with me? Michael exhaled, not from fatigue, but from the sudden release of years of tension. He offered his hand. I'd be honored. They walked together to the center of the floor, father and daughter, surrounded by guests who made room without needing to be told. The lights dimmed slightly. The music swelled. And then they danced. It wasn't graceful. Michael's steps were slow, stiff even. But it didn't matter. Emily held him gently, her head against his shoulder, and they moved as one. It was the dance he had dreamed of, not because of the cameras or the ceremony, but because it was real. Around them, other couples joined in, but the focus remained on them. In that moment, Michael Anderson wasn't just a father. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was a man seen. A man whose name now echoed in the hearts of everyone in the room. And though the night would end, and the flowers would wilt, and the lights would one day fade, the story of what had happened here, what had been revealed, would live on. Not in viral videos or social media highlights, but in the quiet way people would begin to look at their own fathers, their own sacrifices, and the names they had once taken for granted. Names like Michael Anderson. The final notes of the father-daughter dance faded into a gentle hush as guests eased back to their seats, some whispering softly, others simply watching, still processing everything that had unfolded. A few wiped at their eyes discreetly, moved not only by the emotion of the moment but by what it had revealed about the quiet dignity of a man they had barely noticed hours earlier. Michael and Emily stepped off the dance floor hand in hand, not smiling broadly but with a quietness between them that spoke more than words. A fragile understanding had begun to take root. It was not instant forgiveness. Not full reconciliation. But the walls had cracked, and the silence that had once filled the distance between them was now giving way to something closer to respect. Back at his table, Michael sat slowly. A waiter offered him a fresh drink, and for the first time that evening, he accepted. Water, not wine. He didn't want to cloud his head now. Across the room, Richard returned to his seat, greeted by firm handshakes and hushed thanks from those nearby. He didn't bask in it. He simply nodded, occasionally glancing toward Michael as if ensuring he was still grounded in the aftermath of what had been revealed. David approached his new father-in-law again, this time not with scripted politeness, but with a hesitation that came from genuine reflection. "Michael," he said, "can I sit with you for a second?" Michael gestured to the empty chair beside him. David sat, placing his glass carefully on the table. "I keep going over everything in my head," David began, not quite looking at him. "Your daughter, she's brilliant. Strong. But I think even she didn't realize how much you carried alone." Michael didn't respond immediately. He watched the flickering light of the candle at the center of their table. "She loves you, you know," David added. "Even when she doesn't know how to show it." Michael let the silence stretch just enough to give weight to what would follow. "Love without understanding," he said, "can feel a lot like distance." David nodded. "I get that." They sat quietly for a beat. "I want to learn," David continued. "About who you are. Where Emily comes from. I think I've only been hearing half the story." Michael looked at the young man now, not as a rival, not as a replacement, but as a man standing at the beginning of a long road. "It's not too late to listen," he said. A slow breath escaped David's chest, as though some unseen burden had eased just slightly. Across the room, Emily watched them. Her father and her husband, speaking at last. The sight grounded her in a way nothing else had all day. She had imagined 1,000 versions of her wedding growing up, but never this, never a night marked not by spectacle, but by reckoning. Then, as guests began to resume conversations and the playlist shifted back to livelier songs, a tap on Michael's shoulder drew his attention. It was Richard again. "There's one more thing," Richard said. "If you're willing." Michael tilted his head slightly, curious but wary. "Do you remember what you said to me that night?" Richard asked. Michael frowned. "I said a lot of things. Mostly about your engine." Richard smiled faintly. "No. After you finished. After I asked you what I owed you." Michael still looked uncertain. "You said, nothing. Just keep your head up. Roads are long, but they don't stay dark forever." Michael blinked. That did sound like him. Richard nodded. "I've remembered those words every time I've hit a wall since. And I've built something because of them." He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This," he said, handing it to Michael, "is a draft proposal. My company is launching a new community initiative. We're starting with young mechanics. Training programs. Scholarships. Jobs. But we don't want a corporate name on it." Michael unfolded the paper slowly. At the top, in clean, bold letters, it read, "The Anderson Initiative, built with hands, led by heart." He froze. Richard continued, "We'd like to use your name. With your permission. And, if you're open to it, I'd like you to come on board as an honorary advisor. Help shape it. Visit the sites. Talk to the kids. Michael stared at the paper. Not because he didn't understand it, but because the weight of the moment crashed over him like a quiet tide. His name. Not just on a banner, but on something that could lift others like him. The men and women who lived in silence, in sweat, in work that often went unnoticed until it broke. He looked up, searching Richard's face for some trace of condescension, but found none. Only sincerity. Why me? He asked. Because you already lived the lesson, Richard replied. Now we just want to pass it on. Michael didn't respond right away. His fingers tightened around the edges of the paper, not possessively, but protectively. This wasn't supposed to be my night, he said. Richard smiled gently. Sometimes, the nights that change the most aren't the ones we plan for. Emily had joined them now, standing beside her father again. She read the title over his shoulder, her hand tightening over his. Built with hands, led by heart, she whispered. That's you. Michael's voice was quiet when he finally spoke again. If I say yes, this won't be about me. It'll be about the ones coming after. Richard nodded. Exactly. Michael folded the paper slowly and tucked it into his coat pocket. Then let's build something worth their name. As Richard stepped away to give the moment space, Emily remained. Her eyes still shimmered. But this time, it wasn't from sadness. You've always said you didn't need thanks, she said. But I'm going to say it anyway. He turned to her. Thank you, Dad. Michael didn't reply with words. He just looked at her, really looked, and the silence that passed between them was no longer empty. It was full. Of understanding. Of history. Of love. He had been many things in life. A mechanic. A father. A man in the background. But now, for the first time, Michael Anderson stood not behind anyone's story, but at the center of his own. The evening had shifted again. Not in tone, but in pace. There was a new rhythm now, not dictated by the DJ's playlist or the event planner's timeline, but by the quiet gravity of what had taken place. Conversations were more intentional. Laughter, when it returned, carried warmth rather than noise. People moved through the room with an awareness they hadn't had when they arrived. Michael stood near the back of the hall, no longer tucked into a corner or seated at the edge of someone else's spotlight. He wasn't trying to blend in anymore. He wasn't trying to be small. But even now, he wasn't seeking attention. He was simply being present, whole, seen, and steady. Emily had returned to David's side, her fingers intertwined with his. They spoke quietly, sharing glances and words that didn't need volume to hold weight. She kept looking across the room toward her father, not in guilt, but in something closer to admiration. There was pride in her now, earned, rooted, and finally understood. Then the MC returned, microphone in hand, voice softer than it had been all evening. If I could have your attention one more time, he said, and the room turned. Before we begin our final dance, someone would like to say a few words. David stepped forward, surprising nearly everyone, including Emily. He reached the microphone and paused, taking a deep breath. I wasn't planning to speak again tonight, he began, his voice more vulnerable than it had been in any of his previous speeches. But I need to say something. Not because it's expected. But because it's overdue. He glanced at Emily, then toward the back of the room. I want to talk about Michael Anderson. A murmur of recognition passed among the guests. Some turned instinctively to look for him. I've spent the past few years falling in love with his daughter. And in that time, I never really asked the question that should have come first: who raised her? Who shaped the strength I admire? Who sacrificed so she could be who she is? He looked at Emily again. I didn't ask, because I thought I already knew. I saw the degrees on the wall, the stories from college, the professional photos. But those aren't the whole picture. They're just the edges. He stepped closer to the center of the stage. I know now that the center, the foundation, was built by a man who never asked for credit. Who never demanded attention. Who gave everything, quietly. David's voice wavered. I watched him tonight, and I saw the kind of man I hope to become. Not flashy. Not loud. Just, solid. Honest. Committed. The kind of man who shows up, no matter what. He nodded once toward Michael. You are the reason Emily can love the way she does. The reason she's fierce and loyal and grounded. I owe you more than thanks. I owe you my respect. Michael remained still, but his fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. He hadn't expected this. And it moved something in him deeper than he'd expected. David turned back to the room. If there's anything this night has taught me, it's that the most important people aren't always the ones standing at the front. Sometimes, they're the ones who built the floor we're dancing on. He paused, then raised his glass. To Michael Anderson. A father. A builder. A quiet giant. The room echoed the toast, louder this time, unanimous, heartfelt. Glasses clinked across tables, and a few guests rose without being asked. A standing ovation without a single cue. Michael remained seated, but he nodded slightly in David's direction. And for the first time, there was a real connection between them, not out of obligation, but out of earned regard. The music swelled again. The final dance began, a soft, sweeping melody that wrapped the evening in a sense of closure. Couples filled the floor. Emily and David joined them, moving in easy rhythm, occasionally glancing toward her father. But Michael didn't dance this time. Instead, he stepped outside once more, not to escape, but to breathe. To absorb. The night air was cool now, and the sky above stretched wide and endless. He walked to the same bench near the gravel path where he had first sat earlier that evening. He sat down, not in heaviness, but in peace. Moments later, footsteps approached. It was Emily again, her heels now in her hand, her hair slightly undone, her dress caught in a breeze. She sat beside him, close this time. Everyone's talking about you, she said, eyes on the horizon. I figured they might be, he replied. You hate that, don't you? I didn't come here to be a story, he said. Just a father. She looked at him now. And you were. You are. A silence fell between them, not awkward, but full. I spent so long trying to prove something, she continued. Trying to create a life that felt worthy. I thought maybe if everything looked perfect, it would honor what you gave up for me. I didn't realize I was leaving you out of the picture while doing it. Michael stared ahead. I didn't want perfection, he said. I just wanted to see myself in the life you were building. She nodded, tears filling her eyes again. I want that too now, she said. They sat like that for a while, father and daughter, no longer strangers to each other's pain. Finally, she asked, do you think we can start over? Michael turned his head. No, he said softly. But we can start from here. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Inside, the celebration continued. But out here, under the stars, the real heart of the night had reached its crescendo. Not in the clinking of glasses. Not in the flash of cameras. But in the quiet honesty of a father who had finally been heard, and a daughter who had finally begun to listen. The wedding reception began to slowly unravel, not from fatigue or boredom, but because a natural fullness had settled in. Guests trickled toward the exits in quiet waves, not hurriedly, but with a sense that they had been part of something rare and meaningful. Conversations in corners drifted from wedding logistics to deeper reflections. There was less about the catering, more about the speeches. Less about the dress, more about the man whose name no one had expected to carry the night. Inside, the venue staff began clearing plates and folding tablecloths, their quiet professionalism the final rhythm of a long evening. The DJ, reading the room, had shifted to soft instrumental music, background tones that allowed people to speak without shouting. Children once wild on the dance floor now slept on their parents' laps or dozed across chairs draped in jackets. Michael remained outside for a while longer after Emily left to rejoin David. He wasn't hiding or withdrawing anymore. He was simply allowing himself space to think without interruption. For decades, his role had been to stay in the background, to support without demand, to speak less so others could speak more. But tonight had flipped the order. His voice, his story, had reshaped the air in the room. Eventually, he stood and walked back inside, just as Richard was preparing to leave. "There you are," Richard said, meeting him near the entryway. "I wasn't sure if I'd get the chance to say goodbye." Michael offered a quiet nod. "You changed the night." Richard smiled. "You changed it." I just pointed at what was already there. They shook hands again, but this time it wasn't polite, it was mutual respect sealed in silence. As Richard turned to go, he added, "I'll have my team follow up this week about the initiative. But no pressure. Just think it over." Michael nodded again, slower this time. "I will." After Richard disappeared into the night, Michael noticed that most guests had left. The hall was quieter, calmer. A few small groups still lingered, old friends of the bride's mother, co-workers from David's office, but the core of the evening had passed. Emily approached again, barefoot now, her makeup faint and her expression stripped of ceremony. "David's loading up the car," she said. "We're heading to the hotel soon." Michael smiled faintly. "You two should enjoy the night. Start fresh." "I don't want to go without saying something," she replied. He waited. "I know it's late, and I've said a lot already, but there's one more thing I need you to know." Michael tilted his head slightly. "I grew up thinking I had to leave the past behind to move forward," she said. "I thought I had to separate myself from where I came from to become who I wanted to be." She took a slow breath. "But I've realized that where I came from is the best part of me. The part that kept me grounded when the world around me felt too fast, too big, too demanding. And that part is you." Michael's eyes did not water, but something in his shoulders softened. "Thank you for every broken-down truck," she said. "Every second-hand lunchbox. Every night you came home tired but still asked me how my day was." He didn't respond right away. Then, in a voice steadier than she expected, he said, "You always had answers worth listening to." She smiled and stepped closer. "Can I give you something?" He raised an eyebrow. She reached into the small velvet bag she'd carried during the ceremony and pulled out a square piece of paper. Carefully unfolded, it revealed a photograph, one not from the official wedding albums, but clearly printed from a home computer. It was the photo he'd noticed missing from the hallway collage earlier. Michael and a young Emily under the truck, her cheeks smudged with grease, his hand guiding hers toward a wrench. "I wanted to include it," she said. "But I thought it wouldn't match the others. That it would look too ordinary." She looked up. "But now I know it wasn't ordinary. It was everything." Michael took the photo, running a thumb slowly over its creases. "Where'd you find it?" he asked. "Top drawer. Bottom of an old shoebox." He chuckled lightly. "That's where all the good stuff ends up." She hesitated again. "Would you come see us sometime? When we get settled? I mean, when it's not just holidays. When it's real life." Michael folded the photo gently and tucked it into his wallet. "I'll come," he said. "But only if I get to check under your car now and then." She laughed. "Deal." They hugged again, no longer as strangers finding common ground, but as family reclaiming what had always been there. Just then, David returned from the car. "All set," he said, then looked at Michael. "You need a ride home?" Michael shook his head. "I've got my truck." David smiled. "Of course you do." The three of them stepped out together, into the cool night. Emily and David walked ahead toward their rental car. Michael turned toward the gravel lot where his truck waited, parked in the last row, still bearing the faint scent of oil and the comfort of age. He climbed in slowly, the bench seat creaking beneath him, and sat for a moment before turning the key. The engine rumbled to life, a familiar sound that filled the quiet like a hymn. As he backed out, he glanced at the photo again, resting on the passenger seat now. That single memory, caught on film, no longer belonged to a box in the dark. It was out in the world again, just like him. And as he pulled out onto the road, headlights slicing through the night, he wasn't driving away from something anymore. He was heading toward something new. Not alone. Not forgotten. Seen. Sunrise came softly to the horizon as Michael rode home in his truck, the early light filtering across fields of corn and soy stretching like a golden wave beneath a pale sky. His hands gripped the steering wheel with the ease of habit, yet inside him was something unfamiliar, an unsteady peace, as though the engine in his chest had finally been tuned. The night before, every laughter, glance, silence, etched into him like signatures. Now, the world seemed changed. Not in ways he could explain to others, but inside, something, someone, had awakened. Back at home, he pulled into the driveway of a modest house he had lived in for decades. It stood humble, with faded paint and a sturdy porch light. He switched off the engine and sat for a moment. The silence inside the cab was full, of memory, of hope, of what promised to come. He climbed out and walked onto the porch. Through the kitchen window, he could see Linda, his ex-wife, already at the table with a cup of coffee and her reading glasses perched on her nose. Their relationship had been quiet for years, occasionally filled with small kindnesses but often distant, a mutual agreement to share co-parenting without reopening old wounds. He hesitated, should he wake her? But he found himself wanting to share something. To acknowledge how much of today riveted him, not with guilt, not with need, but simply with the desire to be fully present. Her head lifted at the sound of his footsteps. She rose, straightening the newspaper. "Morning," she said softly. "Morning," he replied. "Mind if I sit?" She waved to the chair across from her. He sat, removing his jacket slowly, placing it on the back of the chair. "You look different," she observed, blinking as though she couldn't quite place it. "Was the wedding tough?" He shook his head, his voice quiet but steady. "It wasn't tough. It was revealing." Linda folded her newspaper, giving him her full attention. He pulled the photo from his wallet, the one Emily had just given him, carefully unfolded, worn edges catching the morning sun. "She found this last night," he said. "Put it in her bag for me." He held it out. Linda leaned forward. They both looked at the young girl smiling under the truck, Michael's hand steadying the tool in her grip. There was grease in her hair, and a sense of wonder in her expression. "She kept that," he said, "years ago." Linda's eyes softened. "She always has been fond of that picture." Michael nodded, glancing at her. "She told me she realized something last night. That she built her life thinking she needed distance from where she came from, so she wouldn't carry the burden I carried. But she learned it was the greatest strength." He set the photo down gently. Linda took a deep breath. "You deserve that, you know," she said. "More than just the photo, or the words shouted in a crowd. You deserve to be recognized." He looked away, focusing on the chipped paint of the table. "Recognition never made sense to me the way it does now," he said. "I used to think if I worked hard, if I was good enough, the life I raised her into would be thanks enough." She reached across and touched his hand. "But it's not just about giving," she said. "It's about being seen. And last night, everyone got to see you." He met her eyes. "I don't know what that means for tomorrow," he admitted. "Or for after." Linda smiled. "It starts right here," she said, "with breakfast and stories and all the small stuff. She's given you a chance to keep being seen." He looked at the kitchen wall where family photos hung, snapshots of birthdays, holidays, fits of childhood hilarity. At the center was a picture of Emily in her graduation gown. He'd framed it himself. Tonight's picture might join it. Later, he found himself walking into the garage. The smell of oil and metal, so familiar it was like home. Tools rested in their places, an engine hoisted in mid-repair, rags stained with years of use, the single light bulb overhead trembling slightly in the morning breeze. He sank into the workbench stool and surveyed the scattered parts before him. No one needed those tools. No one would notice if he kept them or lost them, except maybe this time, he would. Because they had built something real. Something that mattered. He pulled a rag from its jar and began to wipe down a socket wrench, fingers pressing the grime away with deliberate care. The motion felt different now, ritual rather than routine. As he worked, the rising heat of the day drifted in through the open garage door. Insects buzzed, birds called. When he looked up, he saw Emily's car approaching through the dust motes, a sleek silhouette beveled by morning light. His heart tightened gently. She must be on her way over to show him something, or maybe just to talk again. He set the wrench down. When she walked in, she was still in soft clothes, hair pulled back, eyes bright with purpose, not apology. "Dad," she said. He looked up. "There's something I want you to see," she said, holding up a small envelope. He nodded. She passed it over. He opened it to find a handwritten invitation, formal print on heavy paper. It was addressed to Mr. Michael Anderson, inviting him to the launch event of the community initiative. The date, months ahead. There was more, an acknowledgement that the program would bear his name and more information on his role as an advisor. He's speechless. "I felt that point about being seen needed to continue beyond last night," Emily said softly. "I didn't want this to be just emotional. I wanted it to mean something real." He looked at her, really looked, the way the photograph had made him look. The man who raised her, and now the man whose name would stand for making sure others weren't left unseen either. He found his voice. It was hesitant but steady. "Emily," he said, "this is more than I ever expected." She stepped forward. "Let me help." He placed the framed photo of the two of them back on the bench. He reached for her hand. "Start from here," he offered. She smiled, voice thick with gratitude. "From here." They stood in the garage, between past and future, in the quiet light of morning. The work ahead, of restoration, recognition, community, felt daunting and necessary. Outside, the world began its day. But inside that garage, and inside that heart, something had begun too, a recognition not just of what had been given, but of what could be built from it. It was a gray morning in late October when Michael stepped out of his truck and looked up at the new sign being installed above the entrance of a large brick building just outside town. The air was brisk, clouds hanging low, trees around the lot bursting with fall color, deep oranges, fading yellows, rusted reds. A few workers stood by the ladder, guiding the final bolts into place. The sign was simple. No fancy logo. No glossy branding. Just a name. The Anderson Initiative. And beneath it, in smaller letters. Hands that build. Hearts that lead. Michael shoved his hands into the pockets of his jacket, the same brown canvas one he'd worn for years. His boots hit the pavement with the same steady rhythm they always had, but there was something different in the way he carried himself now. He wasn't heavier. He wasn't lighter. He was complete. Inside, the building smelled of fresh paint and newly unpacked lumber. Half the space had been converted into a teaching workshop. Tool benches lined the walls, each station equipped with hand tools, safety goggles, and manuals. The other half was a clean classroom space with white boards, fold-out chairs, and a large screen at the front. It wasn't a school. It wasn't a garage. It was something between the two, something new. A place for people like Michael had been once, young, unsure, overlooked, but willing to learn. Willing to build. Emily was already inside, clipboard in hand, coordinating with a woman from the Foundation's operations team. She wore jeans and a hoodie, hair pulled back, but her voice carried direction and ease. When she saw her father, her face lit up. "You're early," she said, approaching him with a smile. "Old habit," Michael replied. "Better to show up before the work begins. Want the tour?" He nodded. She led him through the space, pointing out the equipment stations, the ventilation upgrades, the storage cabinets already stocked with gloves, cleaning supplies, and tool kits. She stopped at a wall near the entrance where a series of framed photos had just been installed. Michael's eyes scanned the images. There were students from pilot programs in other towns, young men and women standing proudly beside half-finished engines, covered in grease, smiling with eyes that understood purpose. One photo, in the center, caught his attention. It was the same one Emily had once hidden away in a box, the one of her as a child, under a truck, holding a wrench with her father's hands wrapped around hers. But this time, the photo had a caption etched beneath it. Where it all began. Michael stepped back slightly, overwhelmed not by pride, but by something gentler, belonging. His story was not just remembered. It was now embedded in something bigger. Richard arrived shortly after, dressed in a dark coat, hands tucked behind his back. He greeted Emily with a warm handshake and nodded toward Michael. "You see it now?" Richard asked. "What your life has built?" Michael looked around the room, watched as a group of local high schoolers trickled in for orientation. Nervous energy clung to them, postures uncertain, eyes scanning the room for something familiar. "I see the beginning," Michael said. Richard smiled. "That's all we ever really need to see." As orientation began, Michael took a seat near the back of the classroom area. The instructor, a woman with a mechanic's confidence and a teacher's clarity, introduced herself and began to speak. She welcomed the students, spoke about opportunity, commitment, and the value of learning not just with your head, but with your hands. She pointed to the wall. "Before we dive in, I want you to look at that man over there," she said, gesturing to Michael. Heads turned. Some students straightened in their chairs. "That's Michael Anderson. This place is named after him, not because he's famous or rich, but because he understood the value of doing the work. Of staying late. Of showing up even when no one's watching." Michael's eyes met theirs. He gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, just enough to acknowledge their attention. He helped build this program because he believed that skill, grit, and patience matter more than any title, she continued. "And today, you're going to begin writing your own stories, just like he did." The students clapped, uncertain but sincere. Michael didn't stand. He didn't wave. He just sat there, a part of the room, no longer a shadow. No longer someone passing through unnoticed. After orientation, one of the students, a tall, shy kid with hands too big for his sleeves, approached him. "Sir," the boy said awkwardly, "I just wanted to say. I think it's cool what you've done. I didn't know people like you got buildings named after them." Michael chuckled. "Most don't," he said. "But it's not about the building. It's about what happens inside." The boy nodded, uncertain of how to reply. "You planning to stick with this?" Michael asked. "I think so," the boy said. "I like fixing things." "Good," Michael said. "There's always something that needs fixing." Outside, the wind picked up. Leaves danced across the parking lot. The air carried the scent of autumn, of change, but also of harvest. Of things that had taken time to grow finally coming into the light. Later that afternoon, after the students had left and the building had emptied, Michael walked to the far side of the shop. There was one workbench set aside from the others. It had a plaque on the edge. "Reserved for Mr. Anderson." Beneath it sat a fresh set of tools, unopened. Michael stood before it for a long time. Then, with the same patience he'd shown his entire life, he opened the box, one tool at a time, setting them in their drawers, arranging them as he liked. When he was finished, he placed the final item, his old socket wrench, worn from years of use, on top of the bench. The plaque above it read, "Michael Anderson, for those who build quietly." The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the floor. The lights overhead flickered on. Emily stood by the doorway, watching her father settle into his new place, not one of labor alone, but of legacy. "You ready to head out?" she asked. He glanced over, then back at the bench. "In a minute." She smiled and let the door close behind her, giving him space. Michael sat on the stool, the room now quiet except for the hum of lights. He wasn't young anymore. He wasn't looking for recognition. But he had found something better. He had found a way to give what mattered most, to build something that would outlast him. And in that stillness, under the gentle hum of a place built on respect, he smiled. Because now he knew. Some stories aren't loud. They don't begin with fireworks or end with thunder. But they last. And when they're told the right way, with truth and time, they echo long after the tools are set down.